briefly introduce some issues that we've been talking about and thinking about with the team, but also the broader, go ahead, I'll let you do that. The team, but also Darlene and her team, and also more broadly with other people, including our advisory board that a few people in the room sit in, about as we think about sort of best practices, what sorts of things should we be thinking about and trying to share knowledge about. And these are, not completely addressing, sorry, this still isn't mine. No, this is the end of Jesse's.
Sorry, guys.
And so this isn't in any way a completely extensive list. It is a sort of working list that we've come up with more recently. I sent it through to you guys.
Is that the one you emailed at 9 a.m.?
Yep.
It's not on here.
Okay.
I can put it on there now.
Can you quickly, and then I'll just start talking?
You can start
Okay, so the main kinds of issues that we're thinking about are issues that in some way arise in other areas of research, but I think often are thought through in citizen science, in part because citizen science projects start as trying to get people out there participating and so on. Many of them are based in the community, and therefore they're not sort of always conceptualized as research projects to begin with, but then as they transition, they become more research projects. And so the way in which I've been thinking about this, really aligns with some of what Annie and others said this morning, which is that, citizen science ideally should contribute to science. That's the very idea. And there's important things that can happen that aren't, say, the biological science or whatever else. They might be about participants and their experiences, more, let's say, social science, psychology, whatever else. But many of them are trying to get at data about the natural world. And as we think about that, there's some things I think are important to start thinking about. So this is and this meshes some of what Jesse was saying. What does it mean for project design, collaborations, recruitment? And then these are the sorts of issues we've been thinking about. So the first one is, what should the data standards be? And that's just a fancy way of saying people are collecting all sorts of stuff, but are citizen science projects embedding kind of practices around what are sort of the basic principles having to do with FAIR, which is that the data then be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. As such, what we've been doing with SciStarter Australia isn't going to give you that. Like Darlene was saying, SciStarter Australia are not platforms for the project, but what we can do is support and assist people with training, exchange of ideas, places they can use to do this, and so on and so on. I think one of the things we saw when we started to look at projects is people have their own freestanding websites for all sorts of reasons, and then it's very hard to kind of have robust and resilient structures. So I think that's something to talk about. The second one is a much more tricky one, but something I think, and something I've been working on a lot with a few people, I don't think it's embedded in science, let alone citizen science, which is the role of Indigenous data sovereignty and governance in any project. And so the CARE principles go to that, and this is this idea that science, when data is involved, there should be, and it's Indigenous data, and I'll say in a minute what Indigenous data is, you need to think about the collective benefit, so what is coming back to the communities. You need to acknowledge and embed principles for authority of control, and you need to very carefully look at lines of responsibility and more general ethical standards, including about the kinds of questions you're asking and the impacts they're likely to have on local communities. I mean, I think CARE has been formulated in the Indigenous or First Nations context, but these are principles we probably should be thinking about all the time. The interesting part, and the debated part to a certain extent, is what counts as Indigenous data. And I think there is a spectrum. It's fairly easy to think, if you collect, I actually think of Uncle Rod, his father, whom he mentioned, was part of a very early study where they took hair. You may have seen this exhibit at the South Australian Museum from children and did all sorts of things, right? Later, he consented, and they used it for DNA analysis. And that's an interesting thing. So literally, samples from people about people that are Indigenous. That's one end of the spectrum. Those are clearly Indigenous data, right? But when we go out to the other end, if we take a notion of country very seriously, some argue, and you can think about this in the New Zealand context, it's accepted as fairly uncontroversial, that anything that is Indigenous, i.e. Indigenous organisms and country, also are sources of Indigenous data. Fully aware of the implications of this, which would be most of what we do in Australia would be involving Indigenous data. But I want to encourage you to think about that with your own projects, but also think about these principles, which I don't think are very controversial. It's just how would you actually do it? What would it look like? And the ultimate goal of a lot of this is Indigenous leadership in many of these projects, and that's something that I think is a very difficult pathway, but one that needs to be taken very seriously. And being transparent about these data standards, what training would be needed. The second kind of cluster is around this notion of open science, and again, goes along with some things that were said this morning, including by Darlene and Annie. And it is about this very notion of how do you make data available for reuse by other people, and how do you track and evaluate people reusing, but also potential policy uptake. So you get the stuff out there, it's very important. How do you, in some way, be able to sort of say what's worked and what doesn't? And here, this is where SciStarter Australia can be used as kind of a meta-level platform, or we would love to investigate some case studies of how that might be able to work. And this is something Darlene has strong interest as well, as far as what we might be able to embed in the site, as far as research around these sorts of patterns, right? So policy uptake, you can imagine, you could embed other widgets that crawl policy and newspapers and whatever, but we would have to have a very clear kind of set of goals around that. Sorry, I keep forgetting that's not working. So ethics, here's where we go full circle back. Whenever humans are involved, at least in Australia, you're supposed to be in accordance with the National Statement on Ethical Conduct. Now, the trick is in human research. So I do think in lots of your cases, you're not doing human research. You have humans, but they're not doing human research, right? And you have responsibilities, you're participant, whatever, but it's not this formal code. But once we move to the meta-level research, we surely are in the domain of human research, and our participants become human subjects. And so I think we need to think about what that looks like, what the flow-on responsibilities are, and what we need to just have in mind / be trained up in, have resources for. And again, that's something that SciStarter could help with, at least the resourcing and so on. And finally, this closing the loop. We know citizen science works really well at promoting participation, engagement, awareness, but the ultimate goal for many people who talk about citizen science is actual co-construction and involving, for example, participants in analysis and even design, as well as collection. And I feel fairly strongly about this for two reasons. One is sort of pragmatic, and it goes back to the anecdote that someone said this morning that I was horrified about, but then felt better when she said they apologized. Who was that? Somebody talked about that this morning. That scientists thinking this isn't science. I think co-construction is a very well-recognized method in health science and social science, and this is something that needs to be embedded more in projects. It's tricky even for them, because often, you get started and the project's already been designed. But I think thinking very consciously, maybe about episodic citizen science projects, you're going to have a blitz, or you're going to have, a particular day or whatever. How could you actually involve participants in the construction of it, and then in the analysis as well? And how could we embed these principles? So in some way, this is part of what it takes to count as science. Now, science comes in many different forms. There's lots of technicians in science who also aren't recognized, who don't necessarily do the analysis. I'm not saying every project would need to go this direction, but I think really to have impact, that process of science needs to be taken out of the black box for participants. And collecting data is one incredibly important step, particularly more consistent ways of collecting data, the way people were talking about their protocols. But then the other step is, well, what's the rest of what goes on in science? And I want to try to encourage us to think about those kinds of issues. And finally, of course, this goes to, how could we build or use SciStarter to help to provide support? Some things are going to be in scope because of the nature of it. Some things are going to be resources or connections in this community. And then other things may need to be addressed in different ways through different sorts of infrastructures.